The scorching sun hung like molten brass over Silver City, casting harsh shadows across weathered wooden buildings that seemed to shrink from its merciless glare. Sheriff William Thompson stood at his office window, fingers drumming against his tin star as he watched another wagon train of prospectors roll into town. The discovery of gold in the nearby Echo Canyon had transformed this quiet desert outpost into a seething cauldron of ambition and desperation. But unlike the starry-eyed miners, Thompson saw the real treasure: power over a boomtown drunk on dreams of wealth. Behind his carefully maintained facade of law and order, Thompson had spent 2 years building a system of corruption that would have impressed even the most hardened city boss. Every claim filing required his personal approval and his personal fee. Every dispute between miners somehow ended with choice parcels being signed over to his hand-picked cronies. Even the local merchants paid their weekly security tax without complaint, having learned early on that resistance meant mysterious fires and vanishing inventory. Sarah Miller watched from behind the counter of her father's general store as yet another miner trudged out, shoulders slumped in defeat after Thompson's latest shakedown. Her hands clenched into fists around the ledger she held, where the mounting evidence of Thompson's extortion was carefully hidden between legitimate entries. Samuel Miller had taught his daughter bookkeeping alongside moral courage, and she'd been documenting the sheriff's schemes since the day he'd first demanded special consideration from their family business. The town's newest arrival stood out immediately, not for his clothes or manner, but for the quiet confidence he carried like a well-worn coat. Jake Johnson had the lean, weathered look of a man who'd spent years under open skies, though his hands showed more familiarity with pen and paper than pick and shovel. He'd opened a small assayer's office, but Sarah had noticed him spending more time studying the town's people than its ore samples. Something in his careful observation reminded her of a chess player evaluating positions before the first move. The catalyst came on a sweltering afternoon when James Davis, a grizzled prospector who'd struck a promising vein, was found dead in his claim. Thompson declared it an accident, but whispers spread about Davis's refusal to sell his stake to the sheriff's mining company. That night, Sarah shared her ledgers with Jake, confirming his suspicions about the pattern of corruption. What she didn't expect was his revelation. He wasn't just an assayer, but a federal marshal investigating reports of claim, jumping, and murder across the territory. Thomas Wilson had always been Thompson's most reliable deputy, more through fear than loyalty. The sheriff kept a tight grip on his subordinate through knowledge of Wilson's past, a stagecoach robbery gone wrong that had left 3 passengers dead. But as he watched Thompson's increasingly brutal methods, Wilson felt the weight of years of compromise crushing his conscience. When Jake quietly approached him about turning witness, the deputy saw a chance for redemption that outweighed his fear of the gallows. Elizabeth Davis had married James for his kind heart, rather than his prospects, but his death left her with more than grief. Hidden in their cabin's root cellar, she found detailed maps of the region's richest claims, along with evidence of Thompson's involvement in multiple disappearances. The sheriff's men came to search the property, but Elizabeth had already entrusted the documents to Sarah, who passed them to Jake. The pieces were falling into place, but Thompson's web of influence reached beyond Silver City's borders. The summer heat had begun to break when Catherine Thompson arrived on the afternoon stage, bringing with her the weight of old secrets. The sheriff's estranged sister had her own reasons for opposing her brother's empire, reasons that went back to their father's mysterious death and the family fortune that had vanished with him. Her appearance threw Thompson off balance for the first time, making him wonder if the walls were finally closing in on his carefully constructed kingdom. Word spread through town of a massive gold strike in Echo Canyon, richer than anything yet discovered. Thompson moved quickly to claim it, sending his men to clear out the independent miners by force. But Jake had anticipated this, working with Sarah to spread the false rumor while gathering evidence of the sheriff's response. As tensions rose and violence loomed, the townspeople began to whisper of resistance, their fear of Thompson finally outweighed by their anger at his brazen theft of their dreams. Emma Wilson, the deputy's wife, became an unexpected ally in the growing rebellion. Years of living under Thompson's shadow had taught her to keep secrets, and her position as schoolteacher gave her access to conversations and gossip that others missed. Through her, Jake learned of Thompson's regular meetings with corrupt territorial officials and of the hidden cache of documents that could expose the entire operation. But reaching them would require navigating the sheriff's personal fortress, his own home. The scorching desert wind whipped through Silver City's dusty streets as Jake and Emma met in the shadow of the old livery stable. She passed him a carefully folded map of Thompson's house, drawn from memory during her occasional social visits with the sheriff's wife. Her hands trembled slightly as she pointed out the study where Thompson kept his most damning records. "He's hosting a dinner for the territorial judge next Friday," she whispered. "Most of his men will be stationed around the front of the house, guarding the guests." Sarah watched from her mercantile's window as the pair concluded their furtive meeting. She had transformed her shop into a hub of quiet resistance, with coded messages passed between bags of flour and ammunition secretly stockpiled in the root cellar. The territorial judge's impending arrival added urgency to their plans. Thompson would surely use the occasion to further legitimize his corruption, securing even greater authority over the region. The desert itself seemed to conspire with Thompson, its harsh conditions making any thought of escape nearly impossible. The nearest friendly settlement was Abilene, a grueling 10-day ride through territory controlled by Thompson's allies. Jake knew that any evidence they gathered would have to make it through that gauntlet to reach honest authorities, assuming such authorities even existed beyond Thompson's sphere of influence. William, the town's reluctant undertaker, had been keeping a grim ledger of his own. Each suspicious death, each accident that befell those who opposed Thompson was carefully documented in a hidden journal. He shared these records with Jake, the pages filled with dozens of names, prospectors found dead in their claims, witnesses who disappeared before testifying, critics who suffered fatal falls from their horses. The pattern was clear, but proving Thompson's involvement would require more than circumstantial evidence. As the week progressed, Thompson's men grew more visible and aggressive, prowling the streets in pairs and questioning anyone who lingered too long in conversation. They seemed especially interested in Emma's movements, perhaps sensing her divided loyalties. Jake noticed Thomas, Thompson's most brutal deputy, following her between the schoolhouse and her home, his hand never far from his holster. The discovery of the false gold strike rumor had made Thompson paranoid. He doubled the protection fees demanded from local businesses, claiming the extra money was needed to defend against claim jumpers and bandits. But his greed was finally turning even his staunchest supporters against him. James, the saloon owner who had long benefited from Thompson's patronage, secretly approached Jake with an offer to help. His establishment's backroom could provide cover for planning meetings, and his loyal customers could serve as lookouts. Catherine, the telegraph operator, became another crucial ally. She had been intercepting messages between Thompson and his contacts in Fort Worth, where he apparently maintained a separate business interest. The telegrams hinted at a larger conspiracy, suggesting that Thompson's corruption extended far beyond Silver City's borders. But they also revealed his growing desperation. His empire was built on borrowed money and false promises, and his creditors were becoming impatient. The heat grew more oppressive as Friday approached, matching the mounting tension in Silver City. Jake spent his evenings studying Emma's map, memorizing every detail of Thompson's house. The study was on the second floor, its window facing a steep drop to the rocky ground below. Any attempt to access it would require perfect timing and more than a little luck. But with the territorial judge's arrival only days away, they were running out of both time and options. Elizabeth, who ran the boarding house where many of Thompson's men stayed, reported increasing anxiety among the deputies. They spoke in whispers about trouble brewing in Tombstone, where similar corruption had recently led to open violence. Some were already making plans to leave, sensing that Thompson's reign was approaching its end. But the most loyal among them seemed ready for bloodshed, determined to maintain their privileged position by any means necessary. The resistance had grown beyond what Jake had initially imagined possible. What began as a simple quest for justice had evolved into a complex web of alliances and secrets, each person risking everything for a chance at freedom from Thompson's tyranny. As he watched the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, Jake wondered if their carefully laid plans would be enough to overcome the ruthless efficiency of Thompson's machine. The coming days would test not only their courage but also their ability to trust one another when everything was at stake. The scorching desert wind whipped dust across Silver City's main street as Sarah Miller watched Sheriff James Thompson swagger from the assay office, his saddlebags noticeably heavier than when he'd entered. Through the warped glass of her dry goods store window, she observed his familiar routine, collecting his weekly security fees from the town's struggling merchants and miners. The discovery of gold in the nearby hills had transformed their quiet settlement into a powder keg of greed and desperation, with Thompson positioning himself to profit from every ounce of precious metal that surfaced. Behind her, the store's floorboards creaked as William Davis, a weathered prospector who'd struck a modest claim in the foothills, approached the counter. "Miss Miller," he whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "Thompson's men came by my camp last night. Said if I don't hand over half my weekly findings, they'll make sure claim jumpers pay me a visit. Can't fight 'em alone, but something's got to give." His calloused hands trembled as he placed a small pouch of gold dust on the counter, payment for supplies he could barely afford. Sarah's brother Jake emerged from the stockroom, his face hardening at the sight of William's distress. 3 years younger than Sarah at 26, Jake had watched their father's store slowly bleed dry under Thompson's extortion. The siblings exchanged a knowing look. They weren't the only ones suffering. Every week, more families packed up and abandoned Silver City, leaving behind half-built dreams and empty storefronts. The sheriff's grip was strangling the very life from their community. The situation grew more complex with the arrival of Thomas Wilson, a former cavalry officer turned government mining inspector. He'd taken rooms at Katherine Johnson's boarding house and begun asking pointed questions about claim registration and gold production reports. Thompson's agitation was visible. He'd been skimming official records for months, and Wilson's presence threatened to expose the depth of his corruption. The sheriff's deputies had taken to following the inspector, their intimidation barely concealed. A commotion erupted outside as Samuel Miller, Sarah and Jake's cousin, burst into the store. "Riders coming," he gasped. "Maybe 30 of them. Flying Mexican colors." The news sent a chill through the room. Raiders from south of the border had been growing bolder, striking isolated mining camps and small settlements. Silver City's location and newfound wealth made it an obvious target. Despite their hatred for Thompson, the townspeople would need every gun, including the sheriff's, if they hoped to survive what was coming. Elizabeth Thompson, the sheriff's wife, slipped into the store through the back door, her face drawn with worry. Though she shared her husband's name, she'd long since lost any loyalty to the man he'd become. "James is gathering his deputies," she whispered. "He's planning to take the municipal gold reserves and flee before the raiders arrive. He'll leave us all to die." The revelation sparked something in Sarah, a realization that their community faced a choice between justice and survival. Mary Wilson, Thomas's wife and a former nurse who'd served in frontier hospitals, began organizing the town's women to prepare for the coming fight. They converted the church into a makeshift infirmary while the men gathered weapons and ammunition. Thompson's betrayal had forced unlikely alliances. Miners and merchants who'd been at odds over claims now worked together, strengthening barricades and planning defense strategies. The shared threat was dissolving old rivalries. Emma Davis, William's daughter and one of the town's schoolteachers, proved instrumental in coordinating communications between the scattered mining camps and Silver City proper. Her students carried messages through the hills, warning outlying settlers and gathering intelligence about the raiders' movements. The approaching danger had awakened a spirit of cooperation that Thompson's oppression had nearly crushed, but the sheriff's impending desertion threatened to leave a critical gap in their defenses. Jake Miller and Thomas Wilson confronted Thompson in his office, laying out evidence of his crimes while proposing a compromise. Help defend the town, and they'd ensure he faced a proper trial rather than frontier justice. The sheriff laughed, revealing that he'd already sent his most loyal deputies to secure an escape route. The sound of gunfire in the distance cut their negotiations short. The raiders had arrived sooner than expected, and Silver City's moment of reckoning had come. The town would have to decide quickly: pursue Thompson as he fled with their gold, or unite against the immediate threat to their survival. The first shots echoed through Silver City's narrow streets as townsfolk scrambled for cover. Through the dust-filled air, Jake Miller watched Thompson slip out the back of his office, a leather satchel bulging with stolen gold clutched against his chest. The sheriff darted between buildings, heading for the stables where his fastest horse waited. Jake's fingers tightened around his rifle, but the intensifying gunfire from the town's outskirts demanded his attention. The raiders' advance forced him to make the choice he'd dreaded. Justice would have to wait. Thomas Wilson had already mobilized the miners and shopkeepers into defensive positions, using his experience from the Civil War to coordinate their efforts. The hastily organized militia took shelter behind overturned wagons and stacked crates, their weapons trained on the three main approaches to town. Sarah, the schoolteacher, had transformed her schoolhouse into a makeshift hospital, with Emma and Catherine helping to prepare bandages and boil water. The women's determined efficiency spoke of their frontier resilience, even as fear clouded their eyes. The raiders struck from the west first, a dozen riders emerging from the desert heat like wraiths. Their leader, a scarred man known only as Samuel, had built his reputation on ruthless efficiency. His band had already destroyed two smaller settlements, leaving no survivors to tell their tales. But Silver City's defenders had something those other towns lacked. Desperation born from months of Tombstone's tyranny had hardened them, teaching them to fight back against those who would prey upon them. The first wave of attackers met unexpected resistance. James, the town's blacksmith, had worked through the night with William to fortify key positions with sheets of metal salvaged from abandoned mining equipment. The raiders' bullets sparked harmlessly off their improvised barricades, while return fire found vulnerable targets. 3 bandits fell in the initial exchange, their horses running riderless into the desert. But Samuel proved craftier than expected. As his main force engaged the town's western defenses, smaller groups of raiders circled through the rocky outlying hills, using old mining trails to infiltrate from multiple directions. Jake spotted the flanking movement from his position atop the mercantile building and shouted a warning. The defending townspeople had to split their forces, weakening their main defensive line. The heat grew oppressive as morning stretched toward noon, gunsmoke hanging thick in the stagnant air. Mary, running messages between defensive positions, caught glimpses of Tombstone's deputies maintaining their own barricade near the town's eastern edge. They showed no interest in helping their neighbors, focused solely on keeping their escape route open for their corrupt master. Their betrayal stung, but it also fueled the townspeople's determination to prove they could survive without them. Elizabeth, watching from the church bell tower with her father's spyglass, noticed dust clouds rising from the northern trail. More riders approached, but their orderly formation suggested these weren't additional raiders. Word of Silver City's gold had spread far, attracting not just bandits but also opportunists from larger settlements. A cavalry patrol from Fort Worth had been tracking Samuel's gang, waiting for a chance to claim the bounties on their heads. Their timely arrival could turn the tide, if the town could hold out long enough. The fighting intensified as Samuel recognized his window of opportunity closing. His men launched a concentrated attack on the south wall, where the defensive line was thinnest. Jake and Thomas led a group of miners to reinforce the position, but the exposure cost them. Thomas took a bullet in the shoulder, and 2 others fell before they could reach cover. The raiders pressed their advantage, forcing the defenders to gradually give ground. Behind the lines, Sarah worked frantically to save Thomas's life, her hands steady despite the chaos around them. The schoolteacher's quiet strength had become the town's moral center during Tombstone's reign, and now her determination helped others maintain their courage. As she extracted the bullet from Thomas's shoulder, she caught sight of Tombstone himself, mounting up behind his deputy's barricade. The sheriff's escape represented everything wrong with their situation: authority abandoning its responsibility, leaving others to face the consequences. The sound of cavalry bugles finally cut through the gunfire, heralding the approach of the Fort Worth patrol. Samuel's raiders began to fall back, but their leader wasn't finished. He had recognized Tombstone's departure as an opportunity, ordering his fastest riders to pursue the fleeing sheriff. The gold that Tombstone carried would make a profitable consolation prize. The town's defenders watched the pursuit disappear into the desert haze, torn between relief at their survival and bitter recognition that both their oppressor and their wealth might slip away in the chaos. The scorching sun bore down on Silver City as Sheriff William Tombstone stood on the weathered boardwalk outside his office, watching dust devils dance across the parched main street. His hand rested on the pearl-handled revolver that had helped him maintain his iron grip on the town for the past 5 years. The discovery of gold in the nearby mountains had transformed this quiet desert outpost into a powder keg of greed and desperation, and Tombstone had expertly positioned himself to profit from every ounce of precious metal that passed through. James Miller, once the town's most prosperous merchant, crouched behind a stack of crates near the general store, his heart pounding as he observed the sheriff's familiar morning routine. The uprising they had planned for weeks was about to begin, but news of approaching bandits led by the notorious Jake Davis had thrown their carefully laid plans into chaos. The town council had gathered in secret the previous night, bitterly divided over whether to proceed with confronting Thompson or unite behind him against the greater threat. Sarah Wilson, the schoolteacher who had lost her husband to Thompson's corrupt justice, moved silently through the back alleys, passing coded messages between the conspirators. Her grief had hardened into cold determination, but even she recognized the devastating implications of facing both Thompson and Davis's gang simultaneously. The desert wind carried whispers of approaching horses, and time was running out for Silver City to choose its path. Thomas Johnson, the aging deputy who had witnessed Thompson's transformation from an idealistic lawman to a ruthless tyrant, stood at his post by the jail, torn between duty and conscience. He had secretly been feeding information to the townspeople, but now found himself questioning whether Thompson's experienced leadership might be their only hope against Davis's approaching force of 30 hardened outlaws. The morning's tense stillness shattered as Catherine Miller burst into the street, her dress covered in dust from her desperate ride from the outlying mines. "They're burning everything!" she cried out, her voice carrying across the square. "Davis's men are setting fire to the claims." The news sent ripples of panic through the gathering crowd, and Thompson's hand tightened on his gun as he realized the perfect storm of rebellion and invasion was about to break. Samuel Davis, Jake's younger brother who had settled in Silver City years before, emerged from the saloon with a rifle in his hands. His family ties had been his curse, but now they might prove the town's salvation. He had maintained secret communication with his brother's gang, and knew their true objective wasn't gold or revenge, but something far more valuable hidden beneath the town's old mission church. Elizabeth Thompson, the sheriff's wife who had watched helplessly as power corrupted her husband, made her way through the gathering crowd toward the church. She carried a small leather pouch containing documents that could change everything. Proof that the government had discovered something in the mines that went far beyond gold, something that had driven both Thompson's increasing paranoia and Davis's sudden interest in this remote desert town. Mary Johnson, Thomas's daughter, who worked as a telegraph operator, had intercepted messages revealing the truth about Silver City's gold rush. The precious metal had been a convenient cover for a massive operation involving government geologists and mysterious shipments made under cover of darkness. The approaching conflict was about far more than simple greed or revenge. Emma Wilson, Sarah's sister-in-law and the town's only doctor, positioned herself near the makeshift infirmary they had prepared in the church basement. She knew whatever happened next would require her skills, but she also guarded a secret that connected all the threads of deception woven through Silver City's recent history. Her late husband had been one of the government geologists, and his final letter to her explained everything. The confrontation exploded into violence as Jake Davis's gang appeared on the horizon, their approach coinciding with James Miller's signal to the conspirators. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as the townspeople found themselves caught in a three-way battle between Thompson's deputies, Davis's outlaws, and their own revolution. The air filled with smoke and the metallic tang of blood as Silver City's fate hung in the balance. Thompson proved himself a tactical genius, using the confusion to his advantage as he maneuvered through the chaos. But his confident smirk vanished when he saw Elizabeth emerging from the church with the damning documents, making her way toward the conspirators. His wife's betrayal struck deeper than any bullet, and in that moment of distraction, Samuel Davis made his move. The truth about Silver City's secret emerged in fragments of shouted revelations and desperate confessions as the battle raged. The government's geological survey had discovered not just gold, but a massive deposit of an unknown mineral with extraordinary properties. Thompson had been charged with keeping it secret, while Jake Davis had been hired by foreign interests to secure it by any means necessary. The fighting reached its crescendo around the old mission church, its adobe walls pocked with bullet holes as the three factions converged. Sarah Wilson found herself back-to-back with Thompson, their personal vendetta temporarily forgotten as they fought to prevent Jake Davis from reaching the church's hidden cellar. The sheriff's experience and the townspeople's determination proved a formidable combination. Samuel Davis's divided loyalties finally resolved as he chose his adopted home over his blood, revealing to the conspirators the precise location of his brother's men. This intelligence allowed the townspeople to outmaneuver the outlaws, turning what might have been a massacre into a decisive victory. The desert air rang with gunfire and shouts as Davis's gang found themselves caught in a carefully planned crossfire. The final confrontation came down to a face-off in the church courtyard, where Thompson stood alone against James Miller and Sarah Wilson. The sheriff's gun hand was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of his crimes and the recognition that his kingdom of corruption had crumbled. The choice between surrender and death hung in the air like the desert heat, while in the distance, the last of Davis's men fled into the harsh landscape. The tension in the church courtyard crystallized as Thompson's fingers twitched near his holster. Sarah Wilson stepped forward, her face etched with the pain of countless families who had suffered under his reign. The setting sun cast long shadows across the weathered stones, while dust devils danced at the edges of the confrontation, nature itself seeming to hold its breath. "Your choice, Thompson," Sarah declared, her voice carrying across the yard with the same strength that had rallied the townspeople. "But know that if you draw, you're not just facing us, you're facing all of Silver City." Behind her, the gathered citizens stood firm, their solidarity forged in the crucible of shared oppression and newfound courage. James Miller's steady aim never wavered as he positioned himself to Sarah's right, but his eyes betrayed a deeper understanding of the moment's gravity. The corruption that had poisoned their town wasn't just about Thompson. It was about the choices they would make in victory. The path of vengeance lay open before them, tempting and justified. A rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a trail of dust as they approached at breakneck speed. It was Elizabeth, the schoolteacher, her normally pristine dress covered in trail dust. "Raiders!" she shouted, her voice cracking with urgency. "A large band heading toward Tombstone. They've already burned 3 homesteads along the way." The news rippled through the crowd, shifting the dynamics of the standoff. Thompson's expression changed, the calculating look of a survivor replacing his desperation. "You need me," he said, his voice low and confident. "I'm the only one who knows these raiders, their patterns. I've kept them away from Silver City for years through arrangements." Samuel Davis stepped forward, his face hardened by recent choices. "He's right. These aren't ordinary bandits. They're the Cortez gang. They respect strength and deals, not law." The admission cost him visibly, acknowledging that Thompson's corrupt methods had served a purpose, however distasteful. Sarah's gun remained trained on Thompson, but her mind worked through the implications. The town's newfound unity would face its first test: choose justice for past wrongs or pragmatic alliance against a greater threat. The lives of innocent families in Tombstone hung in the balance, along with the future of their own community. James broke the silence, his words measured and heavy. "We can't let Tombstone burn while we settle our scores, but Thompson," his eyes narrowed, "this isn't forgiveness, it's necessity." The sheriff nodded slowly, understanding the terms of this temporary reprieve. The next hours transformed the church courtyard into a staging ground for an unlikely alliance. Thompson's knowledge of the raiders' tactics merged with the townspeople's determination and Samuel's strategic insight. Maps were spread across makeshift tables as defenders were organized and messengers dispatched to warn neighboring ranches. Sarah watched as Thompson directed preparations with the same efficiency he'd once used to oppress them. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the way the community moved with newfound purpose. This crisis had given them something beyond revenge, a chance to define themselves by more than their grievances. As the sun set behind the distant mesas, riders assembled in the gathering darkness. The desert wind carried the promise of violence, but also possibility. Thompson mounted his horse alongside those who had nearly ended him, their shared purpose temporarily overshadowing old wounds. The fate of 2 towns now rested on whether this fragile alliance could hold. The column of defenders moved out under a star-filled sky, their hoofbeats echoing off canyon walls. Sarah rode near the front, watching Thompson's back with equal measures of distrust and pragmatic acceptance. The true test of Silver City's transformation would come not in the fight ahead, but in how they would handle victory or defeat while maintaining their reclaimed dignity. The raiders' campfires glowed in the distance like malevolent stars, marking their target. As the defenders approached, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if redemption could emerge from the crucible of necessity. The night ahead would determine not just the fate of 2 towns, but whether justice and survival could find common ground in the harsh reality of the frontier. The scorching sun cast long shadows across Silver City's dusty Main Street as Sheriff James Thompson stood on the steps of the jailhouse, watching the gathered crowd with cold calculation. The stolen gold from the recent strikes lay hidden in his private vault, while the townspeople who'd worked the claims stood united against him. their faces etched with determination. Behind them loomed the ominous dust cloud of approaching Apache raiders, forcing an impossible choice upon the community. Thomas Miller stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered hands gripping a miner's pickaxe. "You've stolen more than just gold, Thompson. You've taken our dignity, our futures. But there's 200 warriors bearing down on Silver City, and we need every gun we can muster." The words seemed to pain him physically as he spoke them, years of resentment warring with brutal necessity. Sarah Wilson, the town's schoolteacher who had secretly documented Thompson's crimes in her journals, watched from the doorway of her classroom as the tension mounted. Her papers contained enough evidence to hang the sheriff 10 times over. But with the Apache approaching, those same documents could tear the town apart at the worst possible moment. She clutched the leather-bound journal to her chest, torn between justice and survival. The distant thunder of hooves grew louder as William Davis, the town's telegraph operator, came running down the street waving a yellow paper. "They've hit Fort Worth," he shouted, his voice cracking. "The Apache have burned half the settlement. They're not just raiding, they're waging war." The news sent ripples of fear through the assembled townspeople, temporarily drowning out their anger at Thompson. Catherine Johnson, owner of the Silver City Hotel and secret keeper of the miners' true gold tallies, stepped forward. "James," she addressed the sheriff by his first name, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "We know you've stolen from every claim, skimmed from every strike, but you're also the best shot in 3 territories. We need your guns and your knowledge of the territory. Help us survive this, and afterward." She left the threat unspoken. Sheriff Thompson's hand rested on his pistol as he surveyed the faces before him. Men and women he'd systematically robbed and intimidated for years. His deputy, Jake Miller, stood nervously at his side, young and increasingly uncertain of his loyalties. Thompson's lip curled in a sardonic smile as he considered how quickly his carefully constructed kingdom could crumble. "You need me," Thompson drawled, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Not just my gun, but my gold too. Those Apache warriors won't be turned back with speeches and good intentions. They'll need powder, lead, and men paid well enough to stand their ground." His words carried an uncomfortable truth that made the crowd shift uneasily. Elizabeth Davis, the widow whose husband's gold claim Thompson had stolen through forged documents, pushed through the crowd. "I'll make you a deal, Sheriff," she said, her voice steady despite the hatred in her eyes. "Open your vault. Use that stolen gold to defend Silver City. Do that, and when the dust settles, you ride away. No one follows, no one hunts you down. But you go, and you never return." The proposal hung in the air like gun smoke as Thompson considered. The Apache war drums were audible now, a distant rhythm that grew steadily closer. Samuel Wilson, the town's banker and secret ally in Thompson's schemes, emerged from his office looking pale. "James, there's no time for pride. Those warriors will be here within the hour." Thompson's decision came with the crack of his vault being opened. Gold poured forth, blood money transformed into salvation as the town mobilized. Every able-bodied man and woman took up arms, former enemies standing shoulder to shoulder as the first Apache scouts appeared on the horizon. Thompson organized the defense with the same ruthless efficiency he'd once used to terrorize the town. The battle raged from sunset into the dark hours of night, illuminated by burning arrows and muzzle flashes. Thompson fought like a demon, his accuracy legendary as he dropped warrior after warrior. The townspeople matched his ferocity, defending their homes with desperate courage. By dawn, the Apache had withdrawn, leaving Silver City standing but scarred. As the sun rose on smoking buildings and blood-stained streets, Thompson stood once more before the townspeople. Without a word, he mounted his horse, the saddlebags conspicuously light. The stolen gold had bought the town's survival, but his power was broken. As he rode east toward Tombstone, Sarah Wilson's documented evidence was quietly burned, a final price paid for survival. Catherine Johnson watched him go from her hotel's balcony, her ledgers of his crimes tucked away in a hidden safe. "Sometimes," she mused to Elizabeth Davis, who stood beside her, "justice takes forms we don't expect." The town had lost its wealth but kept its soul, and as the morning sun painted the desert gold, Silver City began to heal. In the years that followed, the story of Silver City's choice became legend, how a community chose survival over vengeance and found redemption in the process. Thompson was never seen again, but his gold remained in the town, transformed into schools, businesses, and new beginnings. The Apache never returned in force, and the town's unity, forged in that desperate night, became its greatest wealth. 10 years after Thompson's departure, Katherine Johnson stood at the same balcony, now weathered by a decade of desert winds. Silver City had transformed from a desperate mining town into a thriving community, its streets lined with sturdy brick buildings instead of hastily constructed wooden shacks. The old hotel, once a symbol of Thompson's corruption, now served as the town hall, its renovated facade a testament to renewal. Elizabeth Davis had become mayor, her steady leadership helping forge the town's new identity. The morning she took office, she'd placed Thompson's old badge in a display case alongside documents detailing the town's transformation, not as a reminder of darkness, but as proof that even the deepest wounds could heal. The schoolhouse she'd helped build now educated over 60 children, including some from neighboring Apache communities with whom the town had established peaceful trade. Sarah Wilson's daughter, Emma, now taught at that school, carrying forward her mother's dream of education as the path to civilization. The young woman often spoke of how that fateful night had shaped the town's character, teaching her students that true strength lay not in gold or guns, but in the bonds between neighbors. The lesson resonated deeply in a community that had chosen unity over vengeance. Word reached Silver City that Thompson had died in Tombstone, penniless and alone, his final years spent drowning in whiskey and regret. Some townsfolk had traveled there to confirm the news, returning with stories of a broken man who spoke endlessly of the desert gold he'd left behind. But his gold had already transformed into something far more valuable. It had built a future. The Apache chief who had once threatened their destruction now traded regularly in Silver City's bustling market. His people brought crafts and knowledge of the desert's healing plants, while the townspeople offered manufactured goods and agricultural products. The marketplace became a symbol of how former enemies could become partners in prosperity, their children playing together in the shade of newly planted cottonwood trees. Catherine's ledgers remained in the safe, but she no longer needed them. The documentation of Thompson's crimes had served its purpose, not as a weapon of revenge, but as a tool for redemption. She'd used copies to help other towns identify and resist corrupt officials, spreading lessons learned in blood and gold across the territory. Her network of correspondence stretched from Abilene to Fort Worth, creating a web of communities committed to justice. The desert itself seemed to have softened its harsh edges around Silver City. Gardens flourished where once only cacti grew, fed by an irrigation system built with Thompson's stolen gold. The same money that had once represented corruption now nourished life, transforming the landscape just as the town's choice had transformed its people. Even the wind seemed to whisper different stories now, tales of redemption rather than revenge. In the end, Silver City's legend grew not from the gold discovered in its mines, but from the wealth found in its people's hearts. The town became known as a place where justice and mercy walked hand in hand, where ancient enemies learned to break bread together, and where the sins of the past were transformed into the foundations of a better future. The choice made on that desperate night continued to bear fruit, proving that sometimes the richest veins aren't found in the ground, but in the courage to choose a different path. As Catherine prepared to hand over the hotel's keys to her daughter, she reflected on how the town's scars had become its strength. The story of Silver City was now told not as a tale of corruption and violence, but as proof that even in the harshest desert, hope could take root and flourish. The gold that had once threatened to destroy them had become the seed of their salvation, transformed by the alchemy of choice and time into something far more precious than mere metal.